Oliver Wendell Holmes once wrote, "Language is the blood of the soul, into which thoughts run, and out of which they grow." Throughout history, there's been a deep fascination with language and the essence of thought. How do each of these things influence one another? Is our language governed by thought, or is thought governed by language? This discourse, though, leads to one inevitable question: what's the relationship between language and thought, and what are the implications for humanity at large? The origins of language, though, are quite hard to pin down, despite, its monumental impacts. This is because speech is ephemeral. There aren't verbs or nouns preserved in amber. There's nothing for us to look back on in fossils. Therefore, most discourse on how language came to be hinges on speculation from the observable effects of language. For example, many theories attribute the origins of language to aspects of the physical world, like onomatopoeia, involuntary sounds from pain or excitement, song and romanticism, and so forth. But each of these theories is flawed because language doesn't follow any of these specific patterns or models. On the contrary, language is incredibly diverse. It represents a massive array of thought and emotion, which is really hard to distill into one simplified pattern. By being intangible as well, it's exceedingly difficult to trace its earliest usage besides written forms the humans have uncovered. On the whole, it suggests that in order to understand language, we have to look at it a different way. As a result, then, most ideas about the origins of language start to stem from assumptions about the human mind. The leading idea comes from Noam Chomsky, who proposed the idea of universal grammar, where there are biological grammatical categories for nouns, verbs, adverbs, and so on. This facilitates language learning in children and adults as they continue to learn the language. So, the child's task is to learn the words of their language and the categories in which they fall into. Then they possess the knowledge to process unfamiliar words and use them in a consistent grammatical structure. As a result, most linguistic scholars have assumed Chomsky's model of language, and many academics are researching the nature of these grammatical categories and the implication of Chomsky's model for language at large. Unfortunately, the jury's still out on what exactly this means on language's influences on thought, so most of the discussion following will hinge on educated speculation on the topic. It's worth noting that even Chomsky's model is still heavily in contention. Dr. Benite Baracco writes that although humans are literally capable of perceiving all the same stimuli as one another, language appears to act as a sort of funnel, a qualifier, if you will. It makes people focus on certain aspects of the physical world to align with how their language arranges their thoughts. For example, some Australian dialects, the people orient themselves better in space better than English people, often know north from south even in the dark, because their languages have absolute spatial diacritics. This means that when referring to a distant object, they don't say that car over there or that tree over there. Rather, they say the car to the north or the tree to the south, because they need to know the direction in order to assemble correct utterances in their language. They're more accustomed than us to paying attention to the cardinal points. So it means that language allows humans to hone in on specific attributes of the world around them. And it's plausible to believe that as language structures thought within patterns, it also alters the range of thought easily accessible by that culture. Benite Baracco continues with this idea and notes that languages tend to focus the attention of their speakers on certain aspects of their environment, physical or cultural, and these aspects can be categorized as lexicalized or grammaticalized. Lexicalizing means that we have specific words for that concept, like snow. But since we don't have words for everything, languages start to build phrases of lexicons to describe them. And some aspects of the world are so deeply encoded within the language itself, they become part of the grammatical structure. These are grammaticalized. This manifests itself in a variety of ways, like certain Native American dialects have parts of the verb referring to the shapes of objects, and grammatical categories like evidentiality, which is a source of knowledge about the facts in a sentence. And this extends to abstract events like the processing of time. In English, time is split into three parts: past, present, and future. But in Yimis, spoken in New Guinea, there are four types of past, ranging from recent events to remote past. And the primary reason that each language has these unique characteristics is usually deeply tied with the culture, religion, and mythology the language has to convey. It's plausible that all of this in tandem strongly affects how these groups of people process time or the physicality of the world between different languages. It's quite hard to turn these findings into a concrete metric for everything, but it's not impossible. For example, we've proven that language affects the perception of color. Discrimination of colors encoded by different words evoke stronger and faster responses in the language regions of the brain if they're encoded by different if they're described by different words rather than the same word. For example, different shades of blue versus just calling all shades of blue blue. This means that we can better discriminate between the shades of blue if we have the words for it than if we don't. So this means a language does, on some level, act as a filter to emphasize the awareness of certain physical traits or speakers of that respective language. This does, however, open up another topic of discussion for how this plays into thought development of bilingual speakers. Do you get the best of both worlds, or do they end up somewhere in the middle? Victoria Marian, a professor of communicative sciences at Northwestern University, notes that, quote, "We find the language experience can change sensory perception. Our discovery is that bilinguals are more likely to integrate across auditory and visual senses." This is interesting because it means that bilingual speakers actually perceive information differently than those who speak a single language. It would also imply that speaking multiple languages pushes people's thoughts in a new direction altogether. For example, when people hear a speech like ba that conflicts with what they see like ga, they will often perceive a completely different sound like da. This is dubbed the McGurk effect. You can try this yourself. Auditory illusion is found to be far more likely to occur in multilingual speakers. On its face, it might seem trivial, but it means that exposure to multiple languages alters how people perceive the world around us, even more than learning any single language can. Similarly, Krista Byers-Heinlein writes that bilingual speakers perceive speech differently, depending on the language that we think we're hearing. This means that people think differently in different languages. For example, different languages arrange thoughts in different ways. For example, in English, I could say, "I'm going to hit you." In Urdu, my mother tongue, I'll say, "Main aapko marunga," which translated straight to English would mean "me you hit." So the structure is definitely very variable between languages, and it changes the way that we have to arrange our thoughts to assemble correct utterances in that language. How exactly that weighs on our thoughts is a big question mark. So I'll still leave that one up to you to decide. Although our deep fascination with language has led us quite away from where we began, there's still a lot to be learned on how exactly language affects perception, especially in regards to abstract thoughts, how it may guide or restrict aspects of thought. And research has yet to delve into how learning more than one language affects that perception. However, as more information is uncovered, humans will be able to gain a greater understanding of language and how it relates to thought. Someday, there might be an empirical answer to the origin of thought and language. Till then, though, we'll continue thinking and searching to someday uncover the essence of thought.